Hello and welcome to Apocalypse Now, dispatches from a world on the brink, the Daily Mail's weekly global news podcast. I'm David Patrikarakos, and I've spent the last 15 years covering foreign affairs and conflict in some of the world's most dangerous places. But even I have to ask, are we now staring into the abyss?
Before 2022, Putin demonstrated a very careful tactic. He was afraid of Western sanctions. He was afraid of the unknowns, and he was playing safe. In 2022, he went all in.
So the tempo, the drumbeat of the Russian offensive is getting bigger and stronger as we go into the summer.
First of all, Ukraine is not going to forget these war crimes. Ukraine is going to pursue him personally and his government, because we cannot, where we have seen, we cannot unsee.
You're not going to send a robot boat. You need a big ship that survives storms, that survives bad weather. So it's more a case of you need old tech, new tech, and you need to have it tailored for the scenario you're going to fight. Otherwise, you fight yesterday's war.
They need to understand that their system is not that strong as they thought, and especially as they're propaganding and they're projecting. They're propaganding themselves as the superpower, which is like a second army in the world. It's whatever they say, but in reality, they have massive cracks in their defense and their organizational system.
It will be a sudden crack, where suddenly the side that losing its morale, can't produce enough equipment, and its people don't want to fight, it will suddenly collapse.
The NBA playoffs are here, and I'm getting my bets in on FanDuel. Talk to me, Chuck GPT. What do you know?
All sorts of interesting stuff, even Charles Barkley's greatest fear.
Hey, nobody needs to know that.
New customers bet $5 and get $200 in bonus bets if you win. FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook.
21 plus and present in select states.
Must be first online real money wager. $5 deposit required. Bonus issued is non-withdrawable bonus bets that expires 7 days after receipt. Restrictions apply. See full terms at FanDuel.com/sportsbook. Gambling problem? Call 1-800-GAMBLER.
Ready to make a real impact every day? Join the Active Day Home Care team and help clients maintain their independence in the comfort of their own homes. Make a difference in someone's life as you provide essential daily assistance and protect their health and happiness. Earn up to $20 an hour and enjoy additional perks like optional daily pay, 401k, paid time off, ongoing educational training, and more. Join a team that values care, compassion, and your professional growth. Visit activeday.com to apply.
Death from above isn't just something painted on the side of Lieutenant Colonel Kilgore's helicopter in Apocalypse Now. Oh no, now you can buy it off the shelf. Over the weekend, Operation Spiderweb used over 100 first-person view drones to hit 4 air bases in Russia. 2 about 200 to 300 kilometers from Moscow, 1 in the far north near Finland above the Arctic Circle, and the other in Siberia over 8,000 kilometers from Ukraine. The operation was planned for a year and a half in total secrecy. The attack, launched with drones smuggled into very close range with their targets and launched from trucks, is a remarkable combination of high and low-tech warfare. So effective was the intelligence aspect of the operation that the drivers of the trucks had no clue about their lethal cargo. And that's not the only place that drones are making their presence felt in Ukraine. Look at her song. Since last summer, Russia has waged a campaign of deliberate drone attacks on civilians and civilian infrastructure, including hospitals, homes, and shops. The attacks are now so widespread that residents in the frontline city refer to them as drone safaris. Russians are hunting humans as awful people hunt animals. And that's not all. Videos of the attacks shot from the drones themselves are often published on Russian social media to the accompaniment of music. Drones are cheap. You can buy them online. One day, Amazon's drones will start bringing us our drones. You can arm them, and then you can drop them from the sky. Lots of drones like hordes of locusts. This is our future. It is very biblical. Very end of days. Consider this fundamental point that strikes me every time I go into Ukraine. Hoard technology, especially weapons technology, and you centralize power. Disperse it, and watch that power dissipate alongside it. So what now for this world of warfare where a $100 drone can suddenly make a 70 million fighter jet look, if not obsolete, then certainly far, far from impregnable? In a moment, we'll speak to Tim Ripley, journalist and editor at Defense Eye, to look more closely at how technology is changing things on the ground in the killing fields of Ukraine. But first, let's turn to former Ukrainian Minister of Defense, Andrei Gorodniuk. Andrei, welcome. Now, Andrei, Ukraine is in many regards now at the very cutting edge of warfare, as we saw last Sunday. When I first went to the front, way back in 2014, all around me were Soviet-era trucks and tanks and artillery. Can you explain to our listeners how the war was fought back in those early days?
Well, I went to the battlefield area also in August 2014, first time. And yes, basically the whole operations were centered around the post-Soviet doctrines of the land warfare. So the Air Force wasn't used. It was used, but marginally. So basically, certainly it didn't impact the tactical situation in the front. So essentially, the whole war was on the ground. The reason the Air Force wasn't used is because Ukraine had a very outdated Air Force at that time. Just had a couple planes, and Russia was like not there. So basically, Russia officially did not participate at that time in the war. However, we clearly knew that it was there and it was all funded by Russia, commanded by Russia, and so on. But it was a proxy war originally. The situation has changed in a few operations in the summer 2014, specifically Lovaisk operation, when we have seen Russian regular forces took part. And then over the next year, Russia gradually incorporated all those independent, so-called independent units, separatist units sometimes, or they were in the West called Russian-backed separatists, but in reality they were proxy forces. So they were formally incorporated into the Russian chain of command as the Army Corps 1 and 2. But formally, until literally 2022, Russia denied their presence. So they didn't want to use Air Force. The land warfare was really outdated mostly. It was old weapons. And then the drones were used already in 2014. Russia was at that time ahead. But they were used to a very limited scope, and basically it was mainly for the correction of the artillery fire.
Yeah, I remember this, and I should point out to our listeners, when Andrei says the Russians said they weren't there, this was because Putin denied his troops were in eastern Ukraine. And I remember being in eastern Ukraine, filing dispatches, seeing soldiers. And my editors back in DC and London would say, I've seen a column of Russian soldiers driving past. And my editors would say, I insist that I put in, but Vladimir Putin says they're not in Ukraine, which was completely nonsensical.
Right.
So what you're saying, of course, is that essentially because Putin claimed he wasn't there, the war always had to be kept below a certain threshold.
That's correct. So they had limited presence there in Donbass, and basically it was always like some units, but not the whole might of the Russian armed forces. Yes,
I remember well these pro-Russia, heavy inverted commas, separatists. Some of them had tattoos on their face. Some were clearly on drugs. Really, they were scraping the bottom of the barrel with many of these people, Russia. And then I remember, of course, the little green men, the men coming in without uniforms into the city of Sloviansk in those early days as Russia took control of eastern Ukraine.
So those days were like Russia experimenting with the concept of the proxy war. For the whole world, pretty much since the very beginning, it was very clear that it was Russia. It was funded and supported, resourced, etc. by Russian government, but it was a very strange historical case, yes.
Now, you were Ukraine's Minister of Defense from 2019 to 2020, appointed by Zelensky, if memory serves.
Right. Yeah.
You played a significant role in modernizing and reforming Ukraine's defense sector. What were the biggest challenges you faced then?
We started that in 2015. Basically, at that time, I headed the Reforms Office of Minister of Defense, which was reporting directly to the minister, and did it until 2018. And then, of course, we continued that with President Zelensky. I have to say that lots of processes accelerated significantly with Zelensky's presence. But this was it was a long and I must say civilizational process, because indeed in 2014, armed forces were not Soviet in terms of like any ideology ideology, because clearly at that time Soviet ideology wasn't present in Ukraine for many years. It was very clear that Ukraine wanted independence. We could see enormous amount of patriotism, volunteering, flags, and after the invasion in 14. But the culture and the doctrine and the organization in the armed forces were extremely outdated, and they had a lot of remainings from the previous decades. And particularly, it was about the organization of the force. It was particularly about the structure, and of course, it was like pretty much outdated equipment. So so if we speak like in Western terms, like capability terms, so from capability perspective, they were despite of the number of the force, because the force was slightly above 120,000, which is not nothing. It's a substantial force, but at the same time, the level of readiness was, of course, very, very low. And we had brigades where you couldn't turn on any vehicle. We had like enormous amount shortage of weapons, equipment, some weapons and some equipment, and basically the state of readiness wasn't there. But then when it started to be upgraded, it was clearly seen that the organizational issues came up. The Ministry of Defense had outdated processes. The armed forces had outdated processes. So what we have seen in 2022, when most of the world expected Russia to prevail within hours of the conflict, was the result of that transformation. And that transformation have been done with the Western partners. UK was one of the key partners at that time, and UK officers, they knew very well about that transformation. But of course, it was internal thing, so it's not like the whole world was interested in that. But then suddenly the world wake up that Ukraine has a much, much better army than everybody expected.
This is the key, I think. I remember speaking to a general who told me that obviously under the Soviet Union, it was all one army. Ukraine and Russia were one
Right.
army.
Yeah.
And you talk about Soviet tactics. He said we had two armies, both working from Soviet tactics, so both who understood what the other was going to do. And 2022, when you escape that Soviet doctrine, is why you surprise the world, is it not?
That's correct. Well, one of the things which defines the Soviet type of army, which transitioned to Russia and stayed there right now, is the top-down command structure. So basically, most of the decisions are made on the very top, and then they kind of descend them to the throughout the chain of command down. Western armies always had the approach bottom-up. So basically, like strategic decisions and like key decisions are made on the top, but then they try to push most of the decisions on a tactical level down. And Ukraine has learned that, and Ukraine has kind of mastered that, because in the beginning of the war, Russia started from many different directions, clearly attempting to overwhelm Ukraine command. And then Zaluzhny, our commander-in-chief at the time, he just said to most of the commanders on the grounds, guys, you're on your own. I give you all support needed, but you make decisions. Don't expect me to make them. Just go and do your best. And that was one of the key shocks for Russia, that Ukraine happened to be effective with this multi-directional, multi-domain, multi-directional fight.
At the start of this war, was there any idea, Andrei, of what sort of long-term campaign the Ukrainian army was going to have to fight? It's already been 11 years now, 3 years since the all-out invasion.
Nobody knew, because clearly Putin demonstrated, before 2022, Putin demonstrated a very careful tactic. He was afraid of Western sanctions. He was afraid of the unknowns, and he was playing safe. In 2022, he went all in. And basically, he understood that without victory, he would be basically failing. So it's either winning or losing. We have seen pretty much no chances for the negotiations back when he started to destroy cities, because destroying cities together with residents, that's a major war crime. And at that time, it was pretty much clear that it would be impossible to find what is called a zone of possible agreement. So basically, he went with such an evil intent that it would be unimaginable to think that he would back off and try to, because at that time, after destroying Mariupol, after destroying cities and villages, killing civilians in that, to that extent, it would be impossible to think that he would then try to come back as a kind of a semi-civilized person, So So it was very clear that we have to survive despite this all-in sort of strategy. Now, after the failure of this kind of a blitzkrieg sort of operation, which he tried to do, he then said that fine, we will do it over the time, because clearly he was expecting the resources of his nation to be prevailing over Ukraine. And at that time it became quite clear that things are extremely serious in the long run. However, in 2022, they were still weaker, much weaker than right now, because they were, first of all, they were shocked with their failures. Secondly, they couldn't operationally at that time plan this multi-directional, multi-frontal campaign properly. So they constantly had failures. And that resulted in counteroffensives in Kharkiv and Kherson. And I do believe that if we had resources back then, we could continue and we could liberate much more territory back in the end of 22, beginning of 23. But then it was a decision to start the counteroffensive, well-prepared counteroffensive, which gave them half a year to prepare. Counteroffensive didn't work out. And then at that time, it became clear that, that seems like it's going to take years.
You talk about Putin's war crimes. You talk about him having passed the point of no return. I think an important point that we need to emphasize, now listeners need to understand, is something that actually a colleague of yours, former Foreign Minister Dmytro Kuleba, said on this podcast. People think of Putin as a president. He's not a president. He's a czar. If he loses in Ukraine, he is the first czar in Russian history to do so. This is not in his pension plan. He is never going to stop.
His rationale indeed is sort of fatalistic, most likely. So he clearly doesn't assume the idea that he can back off, because in this case, even if Ukraine has partially occupied territory, even if Ukraine is still going to develop as a successful Western-style country, there is like absolute desire of Ukrainian people. There is readiness of Ukrainian people. There are like very key roots of democracy here. Economy is picking up every single time when things becoming less desperate, And he clearly understands that successful Ukraine is going to be first of all, Ukraine is not going to forget these war crimes. Ukraine is going to pursue him personally and his government, because we cannot, where we have seen, we cannot unsee, and the world shouldn't allow that. The world shouldn't accept these things to be happening like normal. Normalization of the crime of that extent will have tremendous historical consequences for the whole world. So we cannot accept that. Secondly, he probably has some kind of a personal obsession with this whole thing, with the campaign, with Ukraine and so on. And also, he can only survive inside his country when he projects the image of the sort of like strongman, and successful strongman. We have seen in 2022, when he started to fail in a number of areas, immediately the mutiny developed. Prigozhin, which was his right-hand guy, went against him and so on. So that's what happens with dictators. As soon as they show weakness, they may be thrown away, and that's not the first time in history. And we believe that yes, that's why he's probably going to try to win in all the cases. And for us, it's an existential challenge. But again, this is not the first time in the history when the countries have that challenge, and we need to win, and we need to go through this together.
Operation Spiderweb was 18 months in the planning, and it was incredible, but almost, in the end, kind of very simple in its delivery. Tell us about that.
I can obviously comment on what the world knows about that, but the thing is that certainly this was a special operation, as we call it, and it was clearly a symbol of asymmetric warfare. The drones which were used were short range, so this is not like some super unique, very expensive long range drones, which are currently being manufactured in Ukraine as well. But that was a very simple weapon system. However, it was delivered in a very clandestine and a very innovative native manner. The key thing, which is, well, there's lots of very interesting observations about that, and I'm sure historians will be analyzing this probably for years. But the thing is that Russia, as a claimed superpower, it projects its strengths to various locations around the world. It has presence in Middle East, it has presence in Far East, it has presence in Arctic. Of course, it's kind of has presence in Europe, and etc. But at the same time, it missed a massive issue at home, and what has been damaged was what is called strategic aviation. So the aviation which can fly for like the range of the operation is like thousands of kilometers, and what they did is that they used those planes in order to launch rockets and the missiles against Ukraine, obviously in a very indiscriminatory manner. So basically hitting civilians, buildings, hitting hospitals, schools, whatever. For us, it wasn't a message, because many times people ask, like, what is the message? It wasn't a message. It was a hit on the capability, which had a very serious threat for us, like very practical threat for us. But the way they missed it, the way they found out that they can no longer feel safe in all this distance inside Russia is, of course, quite substantial. So they need to now, first of all, reconsider the whole doctrine of protection, which would take the resources outside of Ukraine, we believe. But also it helps to understand that asymmetric warfare can actually project force way beyond the tactical or operational depths from the front line. So it's a very serious thing.
What we're seeing now is Ukraine able to strike Russia both from within its own territory and, with the use of intelligence operations, smuggling them into Russia themselves. Some of those based in Siberia are almost 8,000 kilometers from the Ukrainian border. This is psychologically crushing for Russia. Wherever they are, the Ukrainians can strike them.
That's correct. And we do believe that with a level of organization inside Russia, and they constantly fail on various organizational matters in the military, they need to understand that their system is not that strong as they thought. And especially as they're propaganding and they're projecting. They're propaganding themselves as the superpower, which is like a second army in the world. It's whatever they say. But in reality, they have massive cracks in their defense and their organizational system. And if they're all in, if they are trying to destroy us, we will certainly be exploiting those cracks.
Tell me about drone warfare and how it helps the underdog in wars.
Drones are, first of all, there are different types of drones. There are maritime unmanned systems. There are like aerial. There are ground-based, and they all operate in a different echelons and the different levels. Drone warfare is changing the warfare of the humanity probably forever. And we need to understand that this is not the unique thing for Ukraine. Drones appeared in various conflicts before this war, even before 2014. However, specifically after 2022 and particularly in 2023, their proliferation on the front, their place and their magnitude, and and their effect, including now a strategic effect, is of course unprecedented. So this is a situation which changes doctrines of the traditional warfare which we see in NATO countries. Some of the NATO doctrines were written with a very clear physical understanding how to destroy enemy's forces and how to prevent them from the success. But they used a different platform. So they used manned aviation, very expensive one, something which you cannot scale in mass, something which takes years to learn, years to build, to train, to support, to sustain the capability, and so on and so on. Now, certain of these operations can be done by much, much less expensive pieces of equipment, which takes weeks to learn and which takes perhaps hours to make sometimes. Of course, there are more complicated drones which takes months to make, but they're still uncompared with the let's say manned aviation and so on. And we see the changes of the fundamental principles of the warfare. Let me give you examples. So one of the key fundamental principles is that in order to win any battle today, any NATO general will tell you that first of all you need to establish air superiority. So this is you control the airspace. So that's what you need to do. Otherwise, you're going to be spending on the ground operation, invest too much resources. You will have a lot of losses, and your victory may not be that decisive, and it may take a very, very long time. But if you have air superiority, you can deliver results much quicker and with much less expenses and losses. Now, the whole concept of air superiority is being reconsidered right now, because you may you may control the airspace in one echelon where you have tactical aviation operating, but then you may have a completely different situation 1,000 meters below, and then in the 10th meters, you may have a totally different situation because tactical drones are operating without any restrictions there. So now the airspace concept is being reconsidered. How do you rule the sky? How do you establish any dominance, any kind of advantage in the airspace if you have multiple different vehicles operating in a very different manners, and losing those vehicles is not such a big deal comparing to losing the F-35, for example, and so you can afford to build a mass of those. And that's what brings up the concept of so-called affordable mass. And now people talking about affordable precise mass. And that totally changes the situation. And a similar situation we have in the maritime domain, which was traditionally built. The whole concept of command of seas was built on having a large platforms, navy ships, operating in the sea, controlling, establishing presence, and so on. Now most of these ships are extremely vulnerable to the unmanned systems, which we have delivered in the sea. Back in 2023, Minister of Armed Forces of UK, Minister Hippie, he called it a functional defeat of the Russian Navy. And that's a very interesting term, which we are developing right now. It's basically, Russian Navy still exists. They still have a command and control structure. They still have some vessels, but at the same time, they cannot deliver any results. They cannot block Black Sea for us, and they have to retreat to the eastern part of the Black Sea, where we still harass them. So essentially, this changes the total Navy doctrine. So that's a magnitude of the unmanned platforms as we see right now. That's the impact. And this is just the beginning. We will see much more coming up soon. So this will be developing further.
And speaking of drones, I'd like to turn to this incredibly disturbing, in fact, disgusting things that we're hearing, that Russians all across the front line, actually, in areas they occupy and in areas they don't, are using drones to hunt Ukrainian civilians, like awful people hunt lions in Africa.
Well, first of all, the moral side of Russian government troops and all those who participate in that war is beyond the comprehension, and basically it's not there. So right now they don't have any limits on what to do. For us, it was a shock back in 2022 when they started to just destroy villages. We clearly established this as a genocidal practice, and since then it's been supported by all international organizations as that Russia has a genocidal war in Ukraine. They destroyed, if you remember, they destroyed Mariupol then with airstrikes, and they were methodologically building after building, understanding that there are civilians there, understanding that civilians were trapped in the basements and without any chances to be rescued. They sieged the city without letting them out. Amount of people civilians who died there, including children and old elderly people, is just like beyond the calculation even still. So that shows that basically we shouldn't be that much surprised with any of those, and it's just like, indeed, it's completely crazy what's going on there. But yes, indeed, they sometimes doing that, and we hear daily reports, and it's not just with drones. Sometimes they just throw rockets on the cities without thinking where are they going to end up. We see civilian buildings being destroyed pretty much regularly, particularly in the eastern cities, Kharkiv, Zaporizhia, Sumy right now, and that's their practice. We believe that, first of all, that's not the one-off cases or some separate campaigns. This is a governmental policy of Russia to terrorize Ukrainian regions in order to kill the will for defense, in order to sort of like make us to agree on whatever terms. The terms which they're bringing, as you know, are essentially capitulation, because if in a hypothetical world anybody accepts those terms, the whole country will turn out in the concentration camp. So for us, we need to survive regardless. But they are trying to kill people's morale, because people's morale in Ukraine is very well known as extremely strong, and it's shown every day. They're trying to kill it through this kind of a random bombing, so the people constantly nervous, constantly understanding that they can die. And and unfortunately, that's the environment in which we need to survive and build our security strategy.
There is no negotiating with Russia short of abject and total surrender, and that is simply unthinkable. Thank you very much.
Thank you, David.
Thank you, Andriy Zaragodniuk, former Ukraine Minister of Defense. This is Apocalypse Now. We'll return after the break with Tim Ripley, journalist and editor at Defense Eye. Welcome back to Apocalypse Now, dispatches from a world on the brink. We're still talking about Ukraine's remarkable Operation Spiderweb attack on Russian bombers deep within their own territory and the changing face of warfare. Joining me now is Tim Ripley, journalist and editor at Defense Eye. Tim, welcome. Let's talk about Operation Spiderweb. And I think it was this combination of high and low tech. Talk us through it, because it was an enormously complex operation. It took a year and a half to plan, but also in certain key regards, incredibly simple.
Yeah, I mean, you're talking about drones that you could buy off the internet from, Amazon or Alibaba, and repurposed with small hand grenade size explosives and launched from the back of a truck, which was smuggled into Russia and driven up next to the air bases and flown off. And the results were, as we saw, several planes being destroyed and the video streamed back to Ukraine for use in their media operation.
And these were no ordinary planes either. We are talking about the long-range strategic bombers that Russia uses to pound Ukrainian cities.
We're talking Tu-95s, Tu-22 M3s. So these are the bombers that take part in Ukraine's in the attacks that are launched on a sort of weekly basis against Ukraine.
This was, for the Ukrainians on the ground, a huge, huge psychological boost.
I think we need to put this very much in the realm of as you say, a psychological operation rather than an operation that's going to have strategic effect to change the course of the war. I mean, we're talking about, they possibly destroyed a dozen or so bombers, damaged probably 2, maybe 3 times as many. But is that going to really change the course of the war? This is a war that is predominantly fought on the ground by the two armies, slugging it out in trenches with artillery and handheld drones and tanks. And as much as the air war attracts a lot of attention, it is not the main event of this war. This is a war that will be decided on the ground by the two armies, who are, as we speak, fighting it out for in perhaps the decisive phase of the war. And the air war, the naval war, attracts a lot of attention overseas, and it gets the Ukrainians lots of credit, and they are seen as being plucky, tech savvy, but it's not going to impact on that ground war per se.
This is hugely embarrassing for Putin. You say it's actually mostly psychological. Agreed. It's mostly about emotion, psychology, and embarrassment is key here. The Russians are going to have to respond. Indeed, Trump took to his Truth Social platform and said he'd spoken to Putin in the last few days, and he'd promised very strongly that they would respond.
Yeah, I mean, it's very clear that the Russians have a strategic game plan for their offensive over the summer. They are, first of all, they knocked out the Kursk incursion quite dramatically and inflicted really heavy losses on the Ukrainians there. They're pushing into Sumy province in the north east of Ukraine, and now they've reactivated their front line in the Donbass with really heavy attacks going in there, and they are supporting it with these weekly drone attacks and missile attacks, 100 to 300 at a time. Every week it seems to be more. So that the tempo, the drumbeat of the Russian offensive is getting bigger and stronger as we go into the summer. And now we're in May, we're in June now, the weather's better, the ground's better. So that Russian ground offensive is going to be stepped up as well. So yes, the Russians are going to respond, but their response will be part, I think, of their strategic plan. They want to really stretch the Ukrainians, attacking on multiple fronts and really putting the pressure on. And this air attack, yes, it's embarrassed the Kremlin. Yes, it's caused damage to their bombers. But the Russian war machine is more than just bombers. It is infantry, tanks, it's fighter planes, it's glide bombs, it's attack helicopters, it's everything. They're putting it all into this offensive. So, I mean, there's a very, tendency, certainly in the West, to portray this as a sort of everything that appears in the news is what's really happening. The stuff the Russians will do will not be a repeat, a mirror image of what the Ukrainians do. They will attack in the way that they want to attack. And we will see their offensive will unfold in a way that we perhaps are not expecting.
In 2022, when the Russians were rolling towards Kiev, it was about those javelins, those NLAWs, those anti-tank missiles. Now it is an artillery war, but it is an artillery war with drones. But one thing that is changing in the ground war, and I'd like your thoughts on this, I'm negotiating my next trip to the front, and I have regiments or brigades that I'm in bed with. It used to be we go to the zero contact line. With the amount of FPV, first person view drones, flying around, we are seeing an expansion of that ground war in terms of front lines.
Well, you're seeing a replacement of old style weapons with new style weapons. And in many ways, the attack on the bombers was an attack on the old Russian Air Force. The old Soviet, it was actually a leftover Soviet Air Force.
Very good point.
And the Russians have replaced their attack planes, their Su-25s or their attack helicopters which were in the old days, in World War II and in the 1980s or Afghanistan, they would use fighter planes, the Su-25, the Frogfoot, the attack helicopters to attack the enemy's lines of communications, their reserve forces, their artillery positions. They would call it interdiction. And they would do that with those types of planes. Now they're doing it with the first-person drones. And we saw it in the Kursk offensive, where the Ukrainian forces obviously advanced into Kursk 20, 30, 40 miles, but they were dependent on 2 or 3 roads for their resupply. And once the Russians got within range of those roads, they were flying their first-person drones up and down the roads and just knocking out any vehicles that moved. So over the 2, 3, 4 months, first 4 months of this year, the Ukrainian forces gradually had their supply lines cut. They couldn't move, they couldn't resupply, they couldn't evacuate their casualties, they couldn't rotate their troops. So their troops eventually became almost besieged in their trenches. And eventually they ran out of food, they were running short on ammunition, their radio batteries were running down. So they were pinned down, and if they hadn't retreated, they would have been overrun in their trenches. And that scenario is being replayed over and over again in that Donbass front, where you see it, and it doesn't get much attention in the West, but the Russians do these pincer moves, break through a bit, and they make the Ukrainians think they're about to be cut off, and they use their first-person drones to cut their supply lines. So the Ukrainians have to trade land for time. They have to pull back, otherwise they're going to be trapped. And this scenario is playing out time and again. I mean, there was one incident only 2 weeks ago, just south of Pavlovsk, where they had to pull out to avoid being surrounded. And you see this playing out time and again. And we're now in May. So over the next 3-4 months, that's the playbook. More and more of these offensives, the Ukrainian front line becomes untenable and they have to retreat. And there comes a point where, have they got any more land to retreat into? That is where the tipping point comes, and they start to lose serious amounts of troops because they can't retreat anymore.
You look at history and you will know this, military technology evolves not just war, but society. And to put it very reductively, when you centralize technology, especially military technology, you centralize power. When you disseminate military technology, the power will disseminate with it, not always completely reordering things. But let's look at drones. It takes about 3 to 4 years to be able to learn how to fly a fighter jet properly. These things cost $30 million upwards. You can learn to pilot a drone at a very basic level in a few days. You can buy it off the internet. When I was in Bakhmut, the soldiers were buying $3,000 drones off the internet. For $30, they were 3D printing a little rocket thing, putting a projectile in it. If you got it right, you could take out a multi-million-dollar T-90T tank. What do you think are the broader effects of what we're seeing in Ukraine in terms of drone technology?
Well, first of all, it's making, as you say, lots of those old-style military hardware tech obsolete in certain scenarios. In this scenario, where you've got two armies toe to toe, where you can employ these drones quite easily, it's making fighter planes, tanks, artillery redundant.
That's really important. You actually think redundant. That's a really strong word, Tim.
Right. There is a danger that we make it too scenario specific, because, I mean, you've been to the front line in Ukraine. It's woods, it's forests, it's rivers, it's bogs, it's marshes. So this is not really terrain that tanks can maneuver in. And in other terrain, in other scenarios, those drones operated by small groups of infantry are really vulnerable. You only have to go to the Middle East, where you have deserts, you have wide open terrain, you have no forests, nowhere to hide, and tanks and armored vehicles and attack helicopters will still dominate. So it's one thing to say in the Ukraine scenario that these weapon systems are redundant, but there are lots of other places where they're really useful and will be really effective. And we have naval warfare, where we've seen the naval warfare in the Black Sea. But when you want to sail a fleet around the world, you're not going to send a robot boat. You need a big ship that survives storms, that survives bad weather. So it's more a case of you need old tech, new tech, and you need to have it tailored for the scenario you're going to fight. Otherwise, you fight yesterday's war.
That big ship scenario, let me ask you, are those big ships, though, not a lot more vulnerable to drones now, especially swarms of them and so on?
Oh, they are. I mean, particularly in contested waters, like we saw only this week, HMS Prince of Wales, our big aircraft carrier, has sailed through the Red Sea within drone range of the Houthis in Yemen. And I wouldn't be giving away any secrets if I said that in the Ministry of Defence and the Royal Navy headquarters in Britain, there were some very nervous days as they sailed that aircraft carrier down the Red Sea within 20 miles of the coast of Yemen to come out of the bottom of the Red Sea, because they were worried that the Houthis could attack it. But once it's out into the Indian Ocean and at sea, the dynamics change. And you have to go into weapon systems that have real range, real power, and you can maneuver your ships to give yourself protection and get out of range of those drone systems. And those drone systems are very dependent on surveillance. They have little endurance, they have little fuel, and also one thing that is very obvious: drones don't really work in bad weather. They are really rubbish when it's snowing and rainy and windy. Wind is really bad for drones because they're really light and they get blown off course. So you've got to be careful to say they are the answer to every scenario.
So let's go back to spider web. We talk about it's not going to make a big difference in terms of Russia's strategic planning for the war and its conduct of the broader war. Absolutely agree. Do you think it will affect its ability to carry out those long-distance attacks on Ukrainian civilian populations?
It will be a marginal impact, because we now see, if you look at one of those big attacks, the one last week where they had 350 weapon system involved, 80% of them were the Shahed drone type weapons, the drones. Then you throw in maybe a dozen or so Iskander ballistic missiles, couple of Kinzhal hypersonic missiles, maybe a dozen or so Caliber submarine launch cruise missiles, and again about a dozen or so air-launched cruise missiles. The Russians have worked out a long time ago that the way to get through the Russian air defense is to have multiple types of weapons on multiple axes to make it as unpredictable as possible. So they are overwhelming the defense by confusing it, by attacking from the south, from the Black Sea, from the east, from the west, from the air, from hypersonic, from ballistic. So the bombers, yes, they threw in part of the cruise missile strike, but they're not the whole package anymore. At the start, 2 years ago, yes, the air-launched cruise missiles were really big, but the Russians have now diversified their attack formations. So they've realized that they have to diversify to stand a chance of penetrating the air defenses.
That leads me to ask you, Tim, what is your assessment for the way that this war is going to go in the next year to 2 years?
This is fundamentally a war of attrition. And wars of attrition involve a mix of three things. First of all, you've got your industrial potential. You've got to make the stuff to fight with. Secondly, you've got to have the people to fight. And then you've got to have the willpower to keep going. Because in a war of attrition, there's no single decisive victory. It is a grind. It is a day after day fight. So you combine those three things and you persevere at the end. So I give you an example, World War I, where it was the ultimate war of attrition, 4 years of war of attrition on the Western Front. And in the summer of 1918, the thing came to its denouement, where you had the German offensive, where they brought all their troops from Russia after the Russian Revolution. They brought all their forces back from the Eastern Front and almost reached Paris. They almost broke through. They almost did it. And then in September, the Allies attacked and they did break through. So in this war of attrition, there comes a point where one side will crack. It will be a sudden crack where suddenly the side that losing its morale, can't produce enough equipment and its people don't want to fight, it will suddenly collapse. Now, so far, both sides have got plenty of will to fight. The Russians have got more people and the Russians have got more stuff. So it comes back to your talk about it being a psychological thing. Over time, the side that loses its morale and will to fight will lose the war. At some point, it'll be quite sudden, I think. Either the Ukrainians or the Russians will suddenly think, we can't go on. And they have to sue for peace, or there's regime change, revolution, whatever. But it will be quite sudden, I think. It won't be a traditional military victory with a massive breakthrough or a Ukrainian troops advancing to Russia or Russian troops taking Kiev. There will come a psychological breaking point where the armies and the populations will say, we can't go on with this. And so far, both sides have been quite keen to fight. The Russians, Ukrainians seem to have quite reasonable morale. They seem to be generating lots of people who want to fight. Both sides have their industrial production has kept up. The Russian, though, industrial capacity is starting to tell. They have a bigger industrial base. And the Russians, of course, have a bigger population, so they can put more people in. But the crucial ingredient will be that psychological breaking point. And so far, we haven't reached it. Maybe this summer will be the point, but it could go on another year at least until both sides realize they're not going to win or they collapse. Their morale collapses, cracks in a decisive way.
Tim Ripley, thank you very much.
Okay.
Thank you to both my guests, former Ukraine Minister of Defense Andriy Zagorodnyuk and Tim Ripley, journalist and editor at Defense Eye. Join me, David Patrikarakos, next time as we continue to bring you dispatches from a world on the brink. Don't forget to follow us on Twitter, TikTok and Instagram at Apocalypse Now Pod, and you can get in touch via email at apocalypsenow@dailymail.com. We'll see you again next week as we ask once more, Apocalypse Now?
In 2022, a group of divers were sucked into an oil pipe and trapped deep beneath the sea. They could have been saved, but they weren't. Following their story has led us to lucrative contracts, failing safety standards, and secretive political relationships, as we ask, why were those men left to die? This is Pipeline. Pipeline is out now, with new episodes released every Thursday. Search Pipeline wherever you get your podcasts.